Shalom, Shabbatah. This is part 11. Just wanted to start this part honoring and remembering here an ancestor. This is from the historical collections of Georgia, containing the most interesting facts, says here. Historical collections of Georgia. And this is Tustenugi Imatla. I hope I'm saying that right. A Creek warrior, and this is what he looks like. You see, do you remember who you are? Do you see this? So when we're talking about Indians, remember, we're talking about the copper-colored tribes of America, the so-called Negro, mulatto-colored, free-colored. So this was passed to me by Lance Johnson. Thanks a lot, brother, for this, info, this correlation, this book. The more we look, the more we find. So thanks a lot for that. And let me just read the story here. It says here that he was a full-blooded Creek and was born on the Tallapoosa River about the year 1793. He was familiarly known by the name of Jim Boy, who was properly entitled to that which we have placed at the head of this article. Tustenuge, meaning warrior, and Ematla, which signifies next to the warrior. When the war broke out in 1811 between the Creeks and Americans, he was too young to wield the tomahawk, but was permitted to follow the warriors. When the Creeks became divided into two parties, one of whom was friendly to the Americans and the other hostile and unwilling to emigrate, Tustenugi Emafla attached himself to the former party. In the Florida War, he rendered important services. His family, consisting of a wife and 9 children, were among the unfortunate persons who were on board the steamboat Monmouth when that vessel sunk, and 236 of the Creeks, including 4 of the children of Tustenugi and Mafla, were drowned. Alright, so unfortunate, right, what happened? We're talking about 236 Creeks. Now, was this an accident or was this something somebody, made happen? But we can never forget the ancestors, right? And these aren't Africans. He was not an African. Again, was a full-blooded Creek. What does full-blooded mean? It means both his parents are Creeks, not just his mom, not just his dad. Both of them are Creeks. He's full-blooded Creek. This is what he looked like. All right. So the Creeks, most of them you can trace back if you really go into the research over to Mexico. Along with the Muskogee speaking tribes of the South Confederate, the Creeks. You can trace them back to Michoacan, I believe, in Mexico. All right. Making Indians white, the judicial abolition of native slavery in revolutionary Virginia and its racial legacy. This is part 3 of this article, why Indians could no longer be slaves. The reason Virginia's courts abolished Indian slavery is less evident than it seems. This part evaluates several possible explanations, including, I think it's trying to say including, statutory interpretation, the influence of the American Revolution, and changing racial perceptions. It ultimately concludes that the abolition of Indian slavery occurred because it strengthened the institution of slavery in Virginia rather than weakening it. So it made it worse, is what they're trying to say. And did you even know there was an Indian abolition? Did you even know there was an Indian abolition? Not African American slavery abolition, Indian abolition. There was. One threshold issue should be addressed and discarded. Indian slavery was economically marginal by the time of the American Revolution. This development contrasted sharply with the African slave population, which nearly doubled in size between 1775 and 1800. Dodge the hijack. Freedom for the descendants of Indians was thus certainly less costly than loosening African bondage. Finding for the plaintiff in a freedom suit, however, was not costless. Dozens of current slaves might be set free upon the determination that a single ancestor was wrongly enslaved, and masters received no compensation for their lost property. Indian emancipation had fewer social consequences than freeing African slaves, but not none. The court granting Indian freedom were still consciously choosing to violate property rights on another normative basis. The rest of this part seeks to unearth that basis. It says Part A, statutory interpretation. The most straightforward explanation of why Virginian courts freed Indian slaves is the one the courts gave. They interpreted and applied the laws that the Assembly had enacted. The Assembly authorized Indian servitude in 1679 and again in 1682, but it repealed those laws in 1705. As originally thought, or in 1691, as the evolution of the court's knowledge suggested, Indian slaves were wrongfully held if they could prove descent from an ancestor enslaved after those dates. They deserved to go free as a matter of law. The line of cases from Robin to Hudgens reflected judges obeying their mandate to enforce the law while perfecting their understanding of the statutory history. This account has much to recommend it, although the court's simplified story obscured a more complicated history. Part of the function of the courts is to bring order to chaos, even at the risk of distorting past realities. There's also a danger in the arrogance of hindsight. A present-day reader cannot help but regard the decision in Robin on the strict facts as baffling. But a historical and cultural gulf separates us from the deciding judges. So hear what he said, they are very important. He says that a present-day reader, you, us, right now, reading this, learning about this case, right? Robin and Hardaway, and how an Indian or so-called Negro slave that was actually an Indian was able to sue for his freedom. He's saying how the present-day reader cannot help but regard the decision in Robin on the strict facts as baffling. This is so baffling to us. They never taught us this stuff in history. But a historical and cultural gulf separates us from the deciding judges, who were not limited to the details that have survived in the archives. Conservatively, the modern-day chronicler can assemble resources unavailable to the actors themselves. You hear that? All right, so us here, right? Today, modern-day chroniclers, right? We can assemble sources that were unavailable to the actors themselves, of the people, because they didn't know, they didn't have a lot of knowledge that we have right now. The participants were unaware of now obvious legal points. Finally, there's no evidence that the judges were insincere in their professions of fidelity to the law. To interpret their opinions as masking their real motivations suggests either deep cynicism or great presumption on the part of the historian. Yet even while we credit the judges' beliefs that they simply enforce the law, we must acknowledge that this explanation does not satisfactorily account for the legal shift. Even relatively straightforward statutes may admit multiple interpretations, so judges must evaluate them based on conformity to some outside or higher principle. In Indian freedom suits, there are particularly salient reasons to question whether statutes alone dictated the court's decisions. The statutory history was conflicted, with little clear evidence of legislative intent and a strong argument based on plain language supporting Indian slavery. Even more compelling was practice. Indian slavery persisted in Virginia, both de facto and de jure, long after the Assembly passed the 1705 or 1691 Act that abolished it. Until Robin, no court had held that Indian slavery itself was no longer legal after 1705 or any other point in Virginian history. So you hear that? Even though, what they're saying is, even though this case, Robin and Hardaway, somebody was able to sue for their freedom, and the way they wanted is by proving or showing that it was illegal, or that Indians had, the right to be free after a certain period of time. There was only like a 12-year period, right? And it was never referenced any time other than that. They didn't want you to know about this, so you can keep doing it. So you don't learn this in history, because that would make you think about what really happened during slavery, who was really getting enslaved, what is indentured servitude, and how, is slavery really how we thought slavery was? Because these are the kind of things that would open our mind to things like this, that would want to make us investigate further, right? So there's a reason why they keep this from you. Robin and its progeny overturned more than a century of legal precedent and accepted practice on the strength of a single statute that had existed for 70 years. The statute may have been a necessary precondition, but it alone is hardly sufficient to explain such a dramatic change in doctrine. To explain the judicial abolition of Indian slavery adequately, we must move beyond the accounts the judges themselves preferred. While not incorrect, their opinions constrained by the conventions of the common law created an artificially autonomous realm of law in parentheses, divorced from social and political considerations. Yet law, particularly the highly charged law of race and slavery, never existed in such a vacuum. Here the passage of time benefits us. All right, so now, years later, we have the information, we can see what really happened, we can see the results, right? How are we living today? What is the state of the society today, or your state, so-called Negro, so-called Black? All right, so with the passage of time, it benefits us. For it allows us to appreciate the confluence of societal and legal trends that judges did not acknowledge at the time. Two important influences in society, the American Revolution and the shift in racial perceptions, were crucial to the judicial abolition of Indian slavery. All right, so I want to show everyone this article from the Washington Post. This is a thunderbolt from the gods right here. So just want to share with you all, and it relates to what we're talking about, in this series, and everything we're learning. So you can see, you got to really research everything, because, they tell us things and it just becomes a story and it's really a fable. You know what I mean? This is just like the Roots movie, Alex Haley. So we got to really research everything. And there's so many things we're finding. And, so imagine if we keep finding these things, how much things, did they cover, how many lies are out there. And I got this article from Jaguar. Jaguar, let them know what's up with this article.
Yeah, man, I found the article actually checking out one of the classic informers to this good original community, man. 1000 Go Ahead. Shout out to 1000 Go Ahead, man. I actually found it in the Undeniable Part 1, African Americans Ain't African. And basically, man, it show you like 41 seconds in that this, Washington Post, is showing you that the African slave trade is basically believed as a myth by historians. And I mean, they saying since the 1990s. So, it's just one of them things where, you got to pay attention to, what's in your face and really look at and examine what's being said, because supposedly this place of no return, this so-called slave house or whatever they was trying to say it is actually known as a residence that was actually built in the 1770s.
All right.
After.
Yeah. So this is a famous historical place, right? Or at least they've told us it was. And all right, know about this. We've heard the term the door of no return. And, Senegal, I just want to say it's one of those places that a lot of American Indians were actually taken. Angola, Senegal, Cape Verde, Europe, Seville, Lisbon, and many other places on that side of the world, American Indians ended up before the so-called transatlantic slave trade. Like 200-300 years before it. So we're gonna read this article right now, so everybody can know the story behind it and the research that was done and why they're saying this right here. So it says, the sincere fiction of Goree Island, Africa's best-known slave trade memorial. All right, this is from 2013 by Max Fisher, Washington Post. Says President Obama visited one of Africa's most famous memorials to the slave trade on Thursday, the House of Slaves on Senegal's Goree Island. The official story is that millions of African slaves passed through the house's door of no return, which faces west across the Atlantic. All right, so the official story, right? They're telling us that. So this is where millions of Africans, passed through and then were taken to the Americas, right? The so-called transatlantic slave trade. Countless visitors have come to contemplate the slave trade and to pay heartfelt tribute, including Nelson Mandela, Pope John Paul II,
and the last 3 U.S. presidents. All right, so we know that most of these, if not all of them, are Freemasons. And you see another one right here, Obama. And they play their games. They go there and do the show. They're just great actors and all that. They're just maintaining the lie. That's how I see it. So it says, except that the official story turns out to be largely a myth. Again, Washington Post. The story of the door of no return in Goree Island. All right. It's basically largely a myth. All right. Largely a myth. Historians have agreed since the 1990s that the house was likely just a private residence that had nothing to do with the slave trade. A private residence, and it had nothing to do with the slave trade. Earlier, we explored this long-standing disconnect between the reality and myth of Goree Island, why it's proven so resilient, and what it says about the world's struggle to deal with this dark chapter in history. University of Chicago historical anthropologist Francois Richard, and West Africa scholar who has studied the slave trade, a West Africa scholar, so he's from West Africa, all right, who has studied the slave trade, has some thoughts about the disconnect between the myth and reality of Goree. Richard emphasizes the house's value as a sort of manifestation of slavery's legacy, which is still so big today that it demands this sort of totem, all right? So it's like they want that lie to be so true that they create these fake fable stories in these fake places. Like it says here, they're saying it demands this sort of totem. All right? He reproduces a term that seems to capture the phenomenon well. It is a sincere fiction. Sincere fiction. Here, Richard, and he says, yes, there has been heated academic debate around Goree, but in the mid-90s, following a controversial article written in 1996 in Le Monde, the debates have largely been on the revisionist side, and most historians today would argue that the scale of the slave trade in Goree was likely much lower than in many other parts of Western Africa. Much lower. For a variety of reasons. I should note, however, that turning the question of international slavery into a statistical exercise is not the most useful way to think about it. And sadly, that legacy has clouded academic debates more than it has helped. So Goree was a transit point, though the volume of trade there was fairly low. Square quotes are important here. So it was it says a transit point, so we got to see it in reverse. So maybe that's where American natives were arriving or around there. And that ebbed and flowed over time, probably decreasing over time, especially after the 1750s, as captives were increasingly retained in Senegal to work in food production. Says here, Max here, when Richard says fairly low, he is referring to estimates of, for example, 33,000 slaves, a huge number by every possible standard, except for the actual transatlantic slave trade of several million. That's a big one right there. All right, so they're saying that this is really the most they can come up with when talking about numbers and slaves that has gone through there or transit.
That's right. That's right.
That's what's up. So, nothing close to, the the several million that was supposedly came out of there from the transatlantic slave trade. So this is important. Why? Because I'm going to show you in future videos that we can definitely show, records, historic accounts of, the American natives being brought over there, and it's definitely going to pass 33,000. It's going to definitely pass 33,000. We have the history to prove that. All right. So in these places, they really don't have the proof to prove, like there was millions of people being shipped out of there. There's no history of that. They've been lying about that. And if you're really a scholar, you got to go do your research. Show the numbers, show the proof, show the millions. Jabari, show the millions that were coming out of there. You got to show that. You got to stop talking smack. You got to show it. All right. Stop conning everybody. Stop lying. Stop confusing people. This is the Matrix. You're one of those agents, and we're exposing your ass. All right. So let's continue with the article. It says, number 2, yes, there was slavery on the island, but a much different kind than the chattel slavery that was established on plantations in the Caribbean and Americas. because that's where it really started. The Spanish and Portuguese were really going over there and enslaving your ancestors all over the Americas. Even in North America, they had colonies there way before the English. And they were bringing them back with them to Seville, Lisbon, and West Africa, and all their colonies all over the world, even in the Pacific side. All right, so it's, you know, it goes all over. And that was from here. We talking about diaspora, that happened here. It's in reverse. Number 3, it says the House of Slaves holds a huge amount of symbolic value as a place of memory, a testimony to a not so savory part of global history. In this sense, the house was erected into a myth, all right? Or perhaps a term I prefer to follow, sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, a sincere fiction, immobilized as a memento, all right? So this is just propaganda, basically. As far as archives will go, the house was built probably in the 1770s, all right? Whoa. Thus rather late in the era of the Atlantic slave trade. So this is really way after they say, you know. So how they, I mean, if you look at the census records, right, in the US, you're gonna see free people of color, millions. All right, so this place that supposedly, you know, millions of Africans were taken from, wasn't even built till the 1770s. We have millions of free people of color in the US way before that. And if you go look at the census records and you go look at the genealogy, as we have done, you're gonna see that there's nowhere in their genealogy that says they were African. All right, so this is very important. All right, so again, this was rather late in the era of the Atlantic trade, at a point when the commerce in slaves was diminishing and when the gum trade was gaining abstinence. So they built this place where supposedly millions of people came out of towards the end when it was diminishing. Do you see the contradiction? All right, go study this stuff, go research. Don't just believe everything they tell you. What's more is it was a residential structure, all right? Upper floor were living quarters. Lower section were probably for merchandise and magazine. And yes, the enslaved people living there were probably attached to the house as cooks, domestics, laborers, traders, etc. And I wouldn't be surprised if they were American Indians. Some people use the history memory couplet to parse the problem of Goree's house of slaves. Example, history concerned with facts and memory, with symbolic value and historical gravity. A mode of effective resonance, absolutely central to identities in the African diaspora. It's not the most satisfying or cutting way of analyzing the phenomenon, but it has the merit of offering a point of entry. What's important to remember, though, is that while the details about the house may not be entirely exact, they do speak to a deeper historical truth, namely the experience and infamy of turning humanity into a commodity. So the important thing here is to know that it did happen, right? But it happened in reverse, really. We can prove thousands, but obviously everything was not always recorded. How much American natives were being brought over to that side of the world, man, it's uncountable. You know, we can't count it. I mean, you see them all over Europe. You see them all over West Africa. You see them all over the world. You got spread throughout the 4 corners of the earth. This is scripture. All right? And so, you know, you would turn into a commodity straight up, and it was in reverse. So finishing up here says, a point of entry is a nice way to describe Goree's famous monument, which is, after all, a literal entry point. So entry, not where they depart from. Entry point, the door of no return. Some scholars have written, even if slaves never really existed through the door, they never really existed through the door, members of the African diaspora created by slavery have since used the site as a way to engage with that legacy, making it sort of a door of no return to a past that was very real, even if the symbol's official history is not. President Obama, all right, so again, the official history is really, it's not real. This is not real. You're following a fable, all right? They're telling you straight up here. President Obama, in his solemn visit here Thursday, seems to have had a similar experience, even if it was based on a small myth within a much larger truth. a much larger truth. And what is that truth, Jaguar? What is that truth, Jaguar?
The truth is that, like you said, it never really happened the way that they are explaining it on a public level, man. These historians are basically investigating the situation and explaining to you that, if anything, like he said, it would be a door of return due to it only having a entry. I mean, come on, man. It's over with, man. This is a much needed, this gotta be shared.
Yeah, so do the research yourself. There's the article. Go see if it's real or not. Go do the research. I mean, they wouldn't just post this on the Washington Post. All right, so the truth is coming out little by little, and know who you are. Know who you are. Know there's a foundational truth, behind fables that they've told us. And it's telling you right here. All right.
Shout out to the people who putting it out there, man, for us to get, man.
Shout out.
Like it's a good thing, man, and much respect to you, bro, because you've done a lot too, man. And let's just keep it going.
Making Indians White, Part 3, Section B. Slavery and the Revolutionary Moment. In contrast to the romanticized conception of a serene founding, the last quarter of the 18th century, the era of Robin and the subsequent decisions, was one of the most tumultuous and unstable periods of American history. As the leveling and emancipatory rhetoric of the American Revolution challenged long-standing institutions, slavery in particular became the focus of considerable debate, as its blatant contradiction of the declared principles of liberty struck many observers. As newly minted Americans attempted to create new policies modeled on Republican principles, they wrestled with methods to eliminate the institution from their midst. One of the most important methods of challenging slavery was judicial. Slavery in the English colonies was born of expediency, not legal tradition. Slavery in the English colonies was born of expediency, not legal tradition. It was not legal. For nearly 2 centuries, the Anglo-American law of slavery consisted of a hodgepodge of custom, local statute, and antiquated philosophizing used to justify pre-existing facts on the ground, while control of slaves' daily lives rested in the private government of the plantation. In the late 18th century, however, courts throughout the Anglo-American world began to challenge the haphazard justifications invoked to support chattel slavery, and issued a number of opinions with profound emancipatory implications. In 1772, at nearly the same moment when Robin brought suit in the General Court, another Virginian slave, James Somerset, also sought his freedom in English court. Somerset's master had taken Somerset to England, where he had attempted to run away. All right, all my people from the UK tuning in, all the Aboriginals of America living over there, abroad in the UK, still representing, supporting. You've been in struggle over there as well. We know, and we can see here since 1772, American Indians were trying to fight for their freedom. They were running away from over there as well. After his recapture, his master passed him to a ship's captain for sale in Jamaica, but Somerset secured a writ of habeas corpus with the help of several abolitionists. The resulting case, Somerset versus Stewart, marked a watershed in English legal history. Lord Mansfield, the most eminent English jurist of the era, held that Somerset, while lawfully enslaved in Virginia, was not a slave in England. The state of slavery is of such nature, he reasoned, that it is incapable of being introduced on any reasons, moral or political. Slavery so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law. Concluding that no such enabling law existed in England, Mansfield ordered that the black must be discharged. The black. There are a number of striking similarities between Somerset and Robin, beyond their near simultaneity. Both cases included extended natural law discussions of the justice of slavery. In both instances, the court also sought to clarify an ambiguous and unsettled legal history through oversimplification. Finally, both courts delivered narrow legal opinions largely limited to the facts of the cases. Mansfield interpreted his decision as applying only when a master sought to transport a slave out of the country. But subsequent opinions as well as popular perception soon gave Somerset, like Robin, a much broader reach. The case achieved canonical status of the decision that abolished slavery in England. The case achieved canonical status as the decision that abolished slavery in England. You hear that? This exaggeration occurred in large part because those most affected by the decision, slaves themselves, insisted on this interpretation, invoking the cases to justify their claims to freedom. The decision in Somerset became known almost immediately in America, where it reinforced the emancipatory rhetoric of the Revolution. So you hear this again, 1772, right? Before the Revolutionary War in America. So this had an influence. This American Indian, Aboriginal, going to England, illegally taken probably and forced to be a slave over there, and he fought for it. He was like, nah, man, I'm not a slave. He knew who he was, right? They're telling us here that he was legally bought as a slave. We don't know if he was an Indian, but we do know that Indians were illegally being sold as slaves. So, okay, which one is it, right? This influenced the American, the rhetoric of the Revolution. You hear that? This is before 1776. So, all right, just like we know Crispus Attucks, right, the Aboriginal first martyr, right, supposedly to die in the Revolutionary War. It's all about you. It's always been all about you, Aboriginal of America. Throughout the colonies, slavery's legal status was under attack. At Harvard's 1773 commencement, students debated whether slavery was illegal because it violated natural law. So this was in Massachusetts, right? Harvard University, Cambridge. Somerset and the American Revolution also inspired slaves in Massachusetts to initiate a number of freedom suits that almost always resulted in the plaintiff's liberty. So we remember earlier that a lot of the Indians remained in New England, right? They weren't sent to the West Indies. So we're still talking about you. We're not talking about when they say many slaves in Massachusetts, they're talking about you. In 1783, a complicated legal battle involving Quoke Walker, an enslaved African, confronted the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. Chief Justice William Cushion charged the jury that whatever usages formerly prevailed or slid in upon us by the example of others on the subject, the advent of the glorious struggle of our rights had enshrined sentiments for favorable to the natural rights of mankind, without regard to complexion, in the Massachusetts Constitution. All right, so we really gotta study if this guy was really African, because I come across a lot of this stuff, and when I really go search into the historical accounts of those times, they're not saying anything about a person being African. They're just calling him a mulatto or Negro, a person who has a dark complexion. Continuing, it says, Cushion therefore concluded, slavery is in my judgment as effectively abolished as it can be by the granting of rights and privileges wholly incompatible and repugnant to its existence. As in Robin and Somerset, the sweeping rhetoric believed narrow and ambiguous holding whose emancipatory potential was limited because the unreported case that survived was half forgotten. But while historians debate whether the case abolished slavery as a matter of law, contemporary popular understanding credited it as a mortal wound to slavery in Massachusetts, which became the only state in the 1790 census with no slaves. Very important, and I got that census. Let me show you right now. Massachusetts was not the only state that abolished slavery after the Revolution. Above the Mason-Dixon line, where slavery was ingrained but less economically vital, every state adopted some form of abolition. Unlike Massachusetts, however, other states adopted legislative plans that eschewed radicalism in favor of gradual emancipation. Pennsylvania, for instance, enacted the law abolishing slavery in 1780, but full emancipation did not occur until 1847. On the national level, the drafting of the new Constitution quickly implicated slavery. Despite the efforts of anti-slavery Northerners, the resulting document allowed Southerners to invoke federal power to protect their slave property. The drafters euphemistically referred to slaves as other persons. You hear that? That's very important in the census records. Other persons, right? Slaves. Held or as persons held to service or labor, providing further evidence of deep discomfort many of them felt. All right, so that's indentured service. In Virginia, where slavery was the center of the economy, the debate was particularly fierce. Virginians were well aware of the growing hostility towards slavery throughout the Anglo-American world, and especially in the courts. News of the Somerset decision arrived in the colony in April 1772. The month Robin was decided, several months later, Virginia newspapers published a full transcript of Manfield's opinion. Anglo-Virginians complained that the case led their slaves to imagine they will be free in Britain, a notion now too prevalent among the Negroes, greatly to the vexation and prejudice of their masters. In 1795, Virginian anti-slavery judge and treatise writer St. George Tucker dispatched a series of queries to Massachusetts regarding how the state had wholly exterminated slavery. The open letter he received in response stressed the role of the judicial courts, including the Quoke-Walker case, in abolishing the institution. At the same time that well-heeled Virginians learned that elite opinion in the North and in Britain was turning against slavery, internal events of the Revolutionary War gave a new urgency to these doubts. The colony's royal governor issued a wartime proclamation offering liberty to any slaves who fought for the British, an act that led thousands of slaves to flee British lines and caused alarm among Virginian planters. Motivated by the combination of fear and genuine desire to reform, the Virginia elite sought to ameliorate slavery in the war's aftermath. In 1778, the legislature abolished the slave trade in an effort to slow the institution's growth in the state. It went on one step further in 1782, when it liberalized the restrictive laws on manumission and allowed owners to free slaves without restriction as long as the slaves were of sound mind and of the right age to support themselves. Scholars debate the extent to which this law undermined slavery, but it produced a dramatic upsurge in Virginia's free black population. You hear that? Free black population. And then we're just talking about you, the natives, American natives, aboriginals. Behind such measures lay the hope of Virginia's liberal reformers that the new restrictions might lead to slavery. Slavery's slow death. Nearly all Virginia's political elite shared the growing distaste for bondage. Manifest in the era's intellectual culture, they excoriated slavery for the injustice it did to the slave, as well as for what they regarded as its deleterious effect on white morals. Their racist ideology and disdain for Africans, however, made them deeply anxious about the presence of free blacks and the potential for racial mixing. All right, you hear what's going on? Caught in this dilemma, they penned vague and abstract plans for slavery to disappear through the power of demographics, even as the state's slave population increased. On a more concrete level, though, they maintained the racial boundaries that kept most blacks enslaved and the few free blacks marginalized and heavily regulated. In 1806, for instance, the legislature added a proviso to the liberal provisions for manumission enacted in 1782. Freed slaves now had to leave the state with within 12 months, or their masters would have to pay a fine. All right, so they didn't want all these free so-called Indians, so-called Negroes around them. They didn't want, in case of any, uprising or whatever, right? You decide to take your land back, right? They didn't want you to go that far, so they would make you leave. They would make your ancestors leave after they were freed, supposedly free, right? A lot of them were never supposed to be slaves. Freedom was desirable only as long as the Virginians did not have to live with their former slaves. This ambivalent commitment to freedom did little to undermine slavery in Virginia. Rather than dying a slow death, the institution remained crucial to the state's economy and society. If anything, the reform measures reconciled slave owners' humanitarian aspirations with the reality of slaveholding. What had been widely regarded as a pernicious but necessary evil was reconceived as a form of benevolent paternalism. Indeed, with the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, Virginia became vital to the plantation complex of the entire South, as nearly 100,000 slaves were exported from the Chesapeake to the new plantations in Kentucky. All right, so you hear that? So again, 100,000 slaves were exported, so-called slaves, right? You Aboriginal, from the Chesapeake to the new plantations in Kentucky, Tennessee, and the lower Mississippi. By the early 19th century, the revolutionary moment and the doubts it occasioned about slavery had largely passed. Many of these well-intentioned men, whose efforts to end slavery in Virginia proved ineffectual, were members of Virginia's legal elite, part of the state's growing class of college-educated professional lawyers. These men enjoyed national prominence and influence. Among them were some of the foremost political leaders and legal scholars of the early republic. Many also played key roles in the Indian freedom suits. George Mason argued Indian slavery violated natural law. Thomas Jefferson recorded Robin versus Hardaway, and once represented a supposedly white plaintiff in a freedom suit himself. Supposedly white, you hear that? Supposedly white in parentheses, must be a light-skinned or mulatto-looking American native. John Marshall successfully represented plaintiffs claiming Indian descent in Hannah versus Davis and Coleman versus Dick and Pat. George Whitty, as Chancellor, presided over the first trial of Hutchins versus Wrights, and St. George Tucker penned the Supreme Court opinions in Pallas and Hutchins. Indian slavery, like African slavery, laid bare to Virginia's legal elite the dissonance between their ideals and their practice. They connected their judicial abolition of Indian slavery with the revolutionary rhetoric of freedom and the efforts to eliminate African slavery gradually. George Mason's arguments in Robin noted that the same principles that justified the opposition to some late acts of power by the British also rejected the power to enslave Indians, who, like the colonists, were naturally free and independent, lacked representation, and existed outside the jurisdiction of the legislature. He also caught the irony that occurred when colonists claimed that they had been enslaved by Parliament's imposition of a paltry tax and money, even as they inflicted the actual joke of perpetual slavery on their free neighbors. Perpetual slavery, because it was supposed to be servitude only with a contract. George Whitty in turn used Mason's revolution-inspired Virginian Declaration of Rights to declare a presumption of freedom for all plaintiffs in freedom suits. Indian slavery, like African slavery, was therefore part of the larger issue of the persistence of bondage in a society that proclaimed itself free. In cases involving Indian slavery, however, getting our other Indians who are called African and Negroes uh, freed. You know what I mean? So they were slick about it. All right. So this is what she's trying to say. It's not like it really helped. It made it worse. Anglo-Virginians had long used race instrumentally to stigmatize enslaved Africans and Indians. In the late 18th century, though, the racial ideology hardened. Before that point, Virginians justified slavery to the extent they gave the matter any thought, with reference to the just war doctrine and claim that they simply availed themselves on the conflicts of others. This rationale reflected earlier consensus, but Virginia's burgeoning legal class knew that the dominant 18th century treatises, steeped in Enlightenment humanism, rejected the claim that war alone provided a right to hold other human beings as property. Instead, Virginians turned increasingly to biological racism, based on an emergent science of race that stressed innate physical differences between races. An emergent science. So he's talking about all these things happening at the same time, like Darwinism and all that. There's an emergent science, right? That started classifying people based on color instead of based on nations or tribes. All right. So this was what the route they went for. They're like, all right, we'll free the Indians, but then we're gonna say because these are Africans or Negroes that they don't fall under that same law. All right. But we already know Indians were being classified as Negroes, coloreds, mulattoes, free persons of color, free Negroes, free blacks. So we're talking about the same people here. Virginia slave owners came to rely on the assumption of black incapacity to justify their practices. Race alone provided sufficient reason for white freedom and black bondage. Black. You keep calling yourself black. That's how they play with you. That's how they enslave you. This racial justification for slavery required coherent and easily classifiable categories. Black and white had to map onto slave and free. You hear that? Again, this racial justification for slavery required coherent and easily classifiable categories. Listen, black and white is the same as saying black is slave and white is free. So if you consider either or, you're either slave or free. All right? You keep calling yourself black, that's what you are. You are a slave. All right? Yet racial differences never remained as pure as white planters hoped. Racial mixing thus became a constant fear of late 18th century whites who sought to control it through restrictive legislation. Despite these harsh laws, though interracial sex remained common, posing legal as well as practical difficulties, the status of offspring of the frequent rape by white masters of black slaves was resolved through redefinition of the word Negro to include mulattoes, who were not described as any person with at least one-fourth part of more of Negro blood. All right, mulattoes. We already know about mulattoes, right? More problematic was sex between black men and white women, which triggered especially harsh penalties, including the possible enslavement of the offending woman. Their offspring, legally entitled to liberty, filled the dockets of colonial and post-revolutionary courts with freedom suits, disproving planters' pious rhetoric about the separation of the races and the chastity of white women. And I just want to emphasize here, just because they're calling these people white didn't mean they were white Europeans. They were just, a lot of the Indians were being classified as white as well, and mulattoes, remember that. So yes, it could be mostly white European women, but it also could be a light-skinned American Indian. All right. This racial melange was made more complicated by the existence of three races in Virginia: whites, blacks, and Indians. The legal and popular lumping of natives and blacks into a common racial underclass blurred the racial lines between blacks and Indians. As both runaway ads and the freedom suits proved, many slaves had some Indian blood in them. Again, we already got that on part 5, but he's going to let us know, she's going to let us know, right? That the legal and popular lumping of natives and blacks into a common racial underclass blurred the racial lines between blacks and Indians. As both runaway ads and the freedom suits proved, many slaves had some Indian blood in them. Many slaves had some No, many slaves were Indian. Were you? Moreover, slaves often ran away to the few remaining Indian reservations where they intermingled with the inhabitants. They went to their people. You went to your people. These mixed categories challenge the ideology of coherent racial boundaries that imagine the division between free and slave as well defined and easily ascertainable. The intellectual response to such ambiguities was to revise earlier tendencies to lump non-whites together and instead exaggerate the essential divisions between races. All right, lump non-whites together. The emergent doctrine of scientific racism provided a convenient rationale here as well. Again, the emergent doctrine of scientific racism, Darwinism, the out of Africa theory, all that, it helped, it helped, it provided a convenient rationale here as well, since it posited that Indians constituted a distinct and more advanced race than Africans. You hear that? Why they call you African? The whole reason why they've been trying to call you African is because classifying you as an African means that you are not as advanced a race as you would be if you were classified as your true self, which was American Indian. For Virginians, this re-evaluation of Indians' relative advancement was eyes of these, Anglo, as they call them, Europeans, that if you were African, then you can be considered all these things they're talking about, that you're less than a human, right? So that is the whole thing about calling you an African American. It's taking your whole identity and it's putting you in a level where you can be disrespected, you can be treated as property, like a savage, like an animal, all right? And they made it a very negative thing to be called African. And then here comes the 80s, and all of a sudden it's a positive thing, African American, right? But this is how they viewed it. This is how they still view it, actually. And you know it, and even yourselves. And drawing this contrast between noble, if primitive, Indians and degraded Africans, Jefferson reflected the views of the era's educated classes and demonstrated how far Virginian racial attitudes had evolved from the 17th century. Far from lumping natives and Africans together, 18th century Virginians distinguished between what they now term the two races, individually comparing black incapacity with Indian achievement. So black, African. Again, you're hearing, right? What these terms are really. The rise of racial essentialism allowed white Virginians to separate Indians from African slavery. The enslavement of Indians became, in the words of Jefferson, an inhuman practice that once prevailed in this country. Once prevailed. I wonder what happened to this prevailing business and their offspring, right? Because their kids, their children continued, right? So what happened to this prevailing, all right? It's still you. It was always you. They just named you African after a certain period, or Negro. While Africans alleged natural depravity and believed to justify their enslavement, Virginians now constructed a racial justification for the abolition of Indian slavery that would not affect the hundreds of thousands of Africans held in bondage, so-called Africans, other Indians that were being classified as Negro, Black, or so-called Africans, held in bondage. Although unimaginable a century earlier, when all people of color were lumped together into a single category, all people of color, all you guys were all together. There was no separation. So how did they start separating you? At what point? You were already mixed. All right? Because it was always you all the same time. It was just different people from different parts of America being a slave. Remember from the beginning, just right from the beginning with the Spanish and Portuguese. The English just continued the same thing. They were the ones taking the natives that the Spanish and the Portuguese were enslaving. They were pirates. The English hired pirates or privateers, and they were raiding the Spanish and Portuguese ships, and they were taking the Indians they had as slaves. They were invading their colonies in the West Indies and taking their captives, which was Indians, and bringing them back to the colonies, like we just read earlier, right? The Caribs were being brought to Virginia, people from Jamaica. All right, let's not forget all this stuff, all right? Again, although unimaginable a century earlier, when all people of color were lumped together into a single category, Virginia had evolved into a society in which Indian freedom did not imply African freedom. Again, Indian freedom did not imply African freedom. These are just tags. In fact, just as black slavery had helped create white freedom, and Indian freedom reinforced African bondage. You hear that, right? Virginian planters could not undo a century and a half of racial mixing, but they could eliminate the antiquated and dissonant elements that now violated their racial ideology, namely the presence of a race they no longer believed deserved slavery in the midst of a race that did. So, even though they can they couldn't undo a century and a half of racial mixing, a century and a half, 150 years of people mixing, what would happen? How can you, after 150 years, separate the people, create two races from these same people that were mixing for 150 years? Right? I mean, does this make sense? The judicial abolition of Indian slavery allowed whites to perpetuate the myth that blackness was a necessary component of servitude. Blackness. You are black, black man, black power, right? Blackness is a necessary component of servitude. Remember, black means slave and black is servitude. In the process, they effaced the remnants of Virginia's complex triracial past and divided their society firmly into white and black. All of a sudden, Indian is gone. You're either white or black. So if you're Indian and light skinned, you're white. If you're Indian and dark skinned, you are black. Slave, you are white. You are free. You live in a reservation. Or you are considered European or white, like there's no Indian in you, but you are under that white skin. Like Farrakhan said, you are red or copper colored, right? That's your ancestry. Although they never regarded natives as their equals, elite Virginians made Indians white to maintain their racial ideology and strengthen African enslavement. I didn't know this was coming. I'm reading this as I go along with you. Again, elite Virginians made Indians white. What have I been saying the whole time? Elite Virginians made Indians white. Again, elite Virginians made Indians white to maintain their racial ideology and strengthen African enslavement. This confluence of statutes, revolutionary liberalism, and evolving racial ideology explains why Virginian lawyers and judges decided in the late 18th century that the descendants of Indian slaves deserved freedom. There was, however, a fourth and equally vital factor. The actions of the slaves themselves, their this freedom, they knew they were Indian. They wouldn't want to be hiding and stuff. So they decided to go fight for their freedom, right? Freedom suits resulted. Then from slaves insisted that the law backed their claims, not those of their masters. The other snippets suggest that Robin and its progeny inspired a similar rights consciousness in other slaves. After Hannah's brother brought suit to recover his freedom, Hannah evidently made an almost continual claim as to her right of freedom, and insomuch that she was threatened to be whipped by her master for mentioning the subject. Her descendants, who quickly filed their petition when they were to be taken from the country, apparently also believed they enjoyed a legal right to freedom. In these instances, slaves did not resist the law slave owners created and imposed upon them, but they modified it to craft their own legal understandings and justifications that cast them, and not their owners, as the lawful members of society. Yet slaves who claimed descent from Indians did not simply acquiesce in the hegemonic legal order, they helped create the legal doctrine that led to their freedom. The slaves who perceived the possibility of freedom forced judges to confront the issue of Indian slavery, filing lawsuit after lawsuit. The persistence widened what had been a narrow legal exception into a general presumption for Indian freedom. We have at last the full account of why a series of court cases in late 18th century Virginia judicially abolished Indian slavery, an institution that a century earlier had been nearly as prevalent and important as African slavery. Again, Indian slavery, an institution a century earlier, before, first, originally, had been nearly as prevalent, or more, and important as African slavery. Very important. He's telling you that the reason they abolished it was to basically make it more legal, the whole African thing, the whole chattel slavery, making it more acceptable. The emancipation of the descendants of Indian slaves resulted from the confluence of a contradictory and malleable statutory history, post-revolutionary emancipatory principles, shifting racial attitudes in slaves, own legal consciousness and insistence upon their rights. The effect of this transformation extended beyond the immediate consequence of freedom for the plaintiffs and their descendants. The Virginian cases helped reconfigure the racial